Hello, I'm Carin Robinson from PwC's Governance Insight Center, and today I'm joined with my colleague Matt DiGiuseppe from the Governance Insight Center. And we're here today to talk to you about a publication that we actually co-authored together, and it's called A Corporate Director's Guide, Using Transparency to Build Trust.
And I really enjoyed writing the paper with you because trust is one of those topics that it's hard to really put some concrete understanding around. But when we looked at the data that came through a couple of our surveys, there really started to emerge a story that needed to be told and an opportunity for boards to be better. And so it was fun to really dig into that concept.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up because the data is really what drove us to write this publication. If you look at the data from a macro level, Americans have lost a large measure of trust in American institutions. But corporations still continue to be the most trusted compared to NGOs, media, the government. In fact, nearly 2/3 of consumers polled in our PwC's Trust in Business survey say they trust U.S. corporations. But based on recent PwC surveys, the micro data is telling us something different. It points to a trust deficit in the boardroom. And this extends not just to investors, but to executives as well. As you know, overall support for director elections fell last year. This was driven by a host of reasons, and this is obviously one indicator. But through our surveys, investors as well as executives, they don't trust directors when it comes to some basic governance principles. In fact, 64% of executives and 58% of investors do not trust boards to remove underperforming directors.
That is lower than I would have thought.
Yeah, and 60% of executives, 40% of investors don't trust the board to effectively assess performance. And then one of our last data points from our survey, 48% of executives, 24% of investors don't trust the board to guide them through a crisis. And these are pretty basic governance foundational elements for boards to look at. Now, we know establishing trust between the board and its stakeholders can definitely be a challenge, but it has to be top of mind for directors. If you think about the new universal proxy rules that are in effect, board tenure, director qualifications, overboarding, all of that is under examination. And activism continues to increase. Historically, directors haven't had to worry about their board seats, but this is changing. So question for you, Matt, is how are boards defining trust? And what are some of the activities that can lead to a board making decisions that could ultimately affect trust in a positive or even a negative way?
Yeah, that's a really great point. And, trust is more than just a company's risks or the organizations it's associated with or positions. Boards are migrating from a conversation around sort of reputation-based orientation of trust to something that's really about what are the relationships that exist between them and their key stakeholders, and how do they understand those relationships and how they will change as they go through the natural sort of operating and decision-making process. The reality is that inevitably almost every company is going to experience a trust event.
Absolutely.
Right? And what is a trust event? I'm sure that's what's in the back of your mind. Things like a cyber breach. It could be negative press that's earned or completely unearned. But the reality is that when those events happen, they can shake the bedrock sort of relationships that a company has with its various different stakeholders, and they tend to have a long tail. Right? As I said, trust events, I imagine you could go through a laundry list of sort of things that have been in the news in the past 5 years. And I bet you could go back even further, even things like small fines that a company faced or something of that nature that sort of bring back up and that company's now front of mind again. And so it's really about managing sort of your relationship with those stakeholders when those types of things happen.
Yeah, and I really like that idea of migrating from reputation to trust. And I think the expectations of the role of the corporation. It's not just about satisfying shareholders anymore. It's about the organization having broader stakeholders. And quite frankly, when companies don't meet stakeholder, expectations, they're considered broken promises. If you think about today's environment, companies have never had so many issues, both from a political and societal perspective, that they've had to weigh in on, which again can have positive or negative impacts. I think it's really important that companies, they have to prioritize and they have to be intentional. So I would ask the question of you, Matt, what are some things that you think boards can do to prepare for the unpredictable and be intentional. And what's the board's role in there?
You mentioned sort of looking beyond shareholders and thinking about the broader stakeholder group. And that's not to the detriment of shareholders, right? These are because we have a better understanding of how we can deliver long-term sustainable returns to our shareholders. And having the buy-in and the trust of your stakeholders is absolutely essential to that being the case, right? So what are some things that boards can do and think about to prepare for that unpredictability? One of the elements that's most important is understanding what are the corporation's purpose and values. And going back to that sort of core first principle concept of knowing what they are, having discussions around them and how they evolve over time, right? Those are not necessarily going to be static concepts, but there are things that are going to evolve along with the organization. And then when you're making decisions as a board and as having a dialogue with management, understanding how those decisions fit into that purpose and values conversation, and having a framework to bring that dialogue into things so that when something goes wrong, and inevitably it will, or you fail to meet a promise, and again, inevitably you will if you're going to be a sustainable organization over the long term, that you can then come back to that understanding of why we made decisions, how it aligned with what we were thinking in terms of the organization, and then have clear transparency with your stakeholders so that you can start that rebuilding process from a common foundation to all of you, right? So if everybody can come back to that purpose, values, bedrock concept, and then rebuild from there, it provides you with the opportunity to regain trust, which is frankly a lot more difficult than losing it. Trust is lost very easily. Regaining it can take some time, but if you went into your dialogue and you had that foundation in purpose and values, then you have the foundation to rebuild trust.
Yeah, no, I think these are all really good suggestions. And I think it is important for us to be clear that even with a framework and a good understanding of your stakeholders, these are tough decisions. I mean, large investors, regulators, and regulators have different priorities, like climate, for example, or others, where the company just may have a different view. So I think it is important to understand that there's no one size fits all here. You mentioned, obviously, some guiding principles of aligning with your purpose and values. What can boards do around sort of a framework for how they think about and respond to trust events?
I think first and foremost, and we talk about this in the context of sustainability, ESG, and sort of all of those topics, right? You can't be all things to all people. Right? It's not going to be possible. There are going to be situations where companies are going to have to make decisions that align best for them, that might be contrary to what some of their stakeholders are interested in, right? You have broad base of stakeholders, they're not homogeneous. But what you can do is, again, by coming back to and having that dialogue from the purpose and values conversation, you can start to alleviate some of those elements, right? It shows up in lending to carbon intensive industries, right? Where organizations need to balance the communities that they serve with what's happening on the broader macro level. And I think you made the point, right? Not everybody's going to agree. This isn't about everybody agreeing and trust being the kumbaya, solution to everything. But it's about, doing what you say and being transparent about why you're doing it so that you can have a really good dialogue around that element, right? And build your brand with all of your key stakeholders, including your critics.
Yeah. Well, and I would add to that too, with the framework, but also pressure testing that framework, right? Making sure that you can respond when something happens. And I think board members can really take a role in the interactions that they have with other stakeholders to get to know their stakeholders, to understand what their concerns and their issues are, and incorporating that into the future strategy.
And that's part of the oversight, right? Is asking those questions about how other stakeholders have been considered in the decision-making process so that you understand the full analysis that went into how the company is choosing to move forward with its strategy and long-term sustainability.
Yeah. Now I want to turn a little bit to transparency, the word of the day, and disclosures. So obviously we know that stakeholders want to place trust in their companies, that incorporate them into that process, and they see value in the actions that boards take to do that. But we also know that increased transparency, disclosure, they're powerful tools in building trust. Stakeholders are looking for new, additional, more nuanced information about boards and companies, in addition to mandatory disclosures. And I think this requires a new way of thinking about board transparency and fundamental governance principles. boards, I think, are beginning to ask the question of why shouldn't we disclose certain information versus why should we? So it's becoming much, more than just a compliance exercise these days. So what are you seeing with regards to best practices that boards can implement to enhance transparency?
Yeah, that's a great question. It comes back to, right, fundamentally, the governance practices at an organization and the way the board oversees management are about putting in place the structures so that the shareholders, the ultimate owners and beneficiaries, can trust that the decisions being made by the board and management team are aligned with their interests, right? That's governance 101, right? And the existing disclosures that exist were about building that sort of transparency into the process. But I think you said it at the very beginning. The data says that maybe we need a little bit more in today's environment, right? It is certainly not the same today as it was a decade ago, not to mention 50 years ago. So what are some things that you can do around that? One is thinking about the proxy disclosure around director bios, right? The director bios, they're a lot better now than they were 5 years ago, but there's still a lot of opportunity to provide more insights into how the board members have gained the skills and expertise that align with the skills and expertise that you've laid out are important to the organization for executing against its strategy and overseeing that execution. The other area is, making use of technology. Videos on websites are a great way to create a personal connection between your board chair, for instance, and a number of different stakeholders. It doesn't just have to be for the shareholders. Your employees will probably go in and watch that video of the chairman.
Absolutely.
Right? You might see your suppliers, committee chairs. There's a lot of opportunity there. And let's be honest, videos build a personal relationship, which actually do help build in trust, right? You're putting a person's face with that role of chairman, not just sort of a concept or a picture in a proxy. And finally, one of the areas that I think is receiving a lot of additional attention is the board assessment process. Most companies, if not all of them, in standard practice, actually do an assessment at least once a year. Providing transparency into how that assessment is sort of operated, or maybe what are one, two things that came out of that assessment that management are changing, can go a very long way. And this doesn't have to create significant risk. It's not about providing a detailed narrative about who doesn't like who, or that committee's materials could be improved. It's talking about, generally there was an opportunity to provide more succinct executive summaries, and so we've implemented that. Right? That's something that's not going to necessarily create significant additional risk, but provides a lot of confidence to those folks that are looking at that disclosure that the governance around the board assessment process is working, and goes back to one of the key elements of those data points that you set up at the beginning, right? There is some trust.
You're using that information.
Yeah, there is some trust deficit around whether or not boards are using that information. I know, and because we talk to boards about this, right, that they are using that information. And so putting that out into the ether can be a net positive.
Great. Thank you, Matt, for joining me today and talking about our publication. I appreciate it. And for more information and to actually see the publication, please do go to PwC's website, Governance Insight Center. You can find the Corporate Director's Guide to Using Transparency to Build Trust. And again, thank you, Matt.
It was great. Thanks, Carin. I enjoyed it.